Muy buenas tardes, soy Ernesto Céspedes, embajador de México en Finlandia, y les doy la más cordial bienvenida a esta transmisión por Facebook Live desde nuestras instalaciones en Helsinki. Esta tarde estamos en compañía de la doctora Adriana Luna Fabritius para hablar de su trabajo académico y de su libro De Cádiz al siglo XXI, 200 años de Constitucionalismo en México e Hispanoamérica, 1812-2012. Voy a cambiar al idioma inglés por motivos de la audiencia objetivo de este evento. Doctora, bienvenida, doctora.
Muchas gracias,
Dr.
señor embajador.
Luna Fabritius, welcome to the Embassy of Mexico. I'm going to introduce you to our audience. Adriana Luna Fabritius is a researcher, member of the prestigious Academy of Finland, and currently working at the University of Helsinki. She is the president of the European Society for the History of Political Thought. Her specialty in history is early modern Italian, Spanish, and Latin American political and constitutional thought. She studied Latin American studies at the National University of Mexico and has a PhD in European Studies at the Instituto Ortega y Gasset in Madrid, and a PhD in History and Civilization at the European University Institute in Florence. In 2009, the Mexican government repatriated her to continue her work in our country, in Mexico. Before working at the University of Helsinki, she worked as a professor at the prestigious CIDE, Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas in Mexico, and was member of our national research system, el Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, since 2010. So, without further ado, I give you Dr. Adriana Luna Fabritius.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the invitation to participate to this event organized by the Mexican Embassy in the framework of the ongoing cultural festival Iberoamericano. I have been invited today to talk about Cádiz constitutional tradition in Spanish America, and my talk is particularly significant because it happens during this year's celebration of the independence of Mexico, with which is directly connected. It is significant because once the fight for the independence was concluded in 1821, with the embrace of Acatempan and the entrance of the Army of the Three Warranties to Mexico City, the whole country entered in a long period of revisiting its roots. As you know, the experiments of this period are varied. But the relevant part is that in the conformation of a new identity, Mexicans had to face immediately central questions regarding their relation with their Spanish legacy. For instance, how legitimate was to ban the presence of the naturals from Spain without renouncing to the use of their language, their institutions, and their culture. Some of the main questions that puzzled Mexican thinkers of the post-independence period and that echoes in the first constitutional moments were whether Mexicans should go back to their indigenous languages and institutions, and in the affirmative case, which indigenous group could provide with the model of institutions and the official language for a new government. How to settle a new country that included a vast territory and a great number of most diverse indigenous communities, mestizos, Creoles, and Spaniards that decide to stay in Mexico after the independence. How to establish a government for a territory that spanned from Oregon to Bocas del Toro, today part of Panama. In this manner, the first decades of the 19th century saw the emergence of colossal historical projects that address these questions directly. To a greater or lesser extent, this was a period of awareness and recognition of the complexity of our indigenous past, but also of our Spanish cultural heritage. Approximately around 2010, all the countries of the Hispanic space started the preparations for the bicentenary of the Constitution of Cádiz. The celebration of that bicentenary was, in several forms, the continuation of the enterprise started by 19th century thinkers and politicians, this time with a focus on the constitutional perspective. In 2012, we celebrated the bicentenary of the Constitution of Cádiz, which was one of the most influential documents of modern liberalism in Europe, but also in America. That celebration opened up again the opportunity to reflect about our shared values and culture, something that in my research I have denominated as a shared normative language. Most of you know why Cádiz Constitution was so important, but for those who doesn't, I'll say some words. In 1808, Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula and forced the abdication of Ferdinand VIII and his father, Charles IV. Napoleon installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne and promulgated the Bayonne Constitution. Most of the Spaniards rejected the French rule and fought a war that ended up in 1814. Meanwhile, the abdication of the king and his son, the Spanish administration formed a government in exile that fortified itself in the port of Cádiz and formed the Supreme Central Junta. From there, the junta called for the general and extraordinary courts that discussed the Constitution of Cádiz, also known as La Pepa, and was enacted in 1812 for all the territories of the Spanish monarchy. At this point, you might be wondering which were the main principles of Cádiz Constitution. In brief, we should stress at least four: national sovereignty, division of powers, a new form of representation, and equality before the law. In addition to these paramount principles, the Constitution recognized some individual rights, such as the right to education, the right to freedom of press, very much related to the freedom of opinion and expression, that, as you know, is crucial for the development of the public sphere, and the right to inviolability of the home, among several others. In a nutshell, the development started by the courts of Cádiz represented the beginning of a liberal revolution in the Hispanic space, as the Supreme Junta assumed the sovereignty of the entire monarchy and called for the general and extraordinary courts, which built the legitimacy of the new government. To the island of León attended 102 deputies, 56 from the free provinces and 46 surrogated from the provinces occupied by the French troops. The composition of the courts themselves has been considered as a crucial element to understand its political implications. In addition to the absolutist groups, it included individuals from the middle classes, considered reformers and revolutionaries in that time. 1/3 of the deputies were members of the clergy, 1/3 were members of the state and militaries, and the other third were lawyers, university professors, among other liberal professions. The presence of the nobility was small in regard to other components. Regarding territorial representation, in 1810, the junta established that all the representatives of the Spanish territories could be elected through its ayuntamientos, town councils, to send representatives to each representative of each viceroyalty and captaincy general to the courts. Regarding the viceroyalties, New Spain, Peru, Granada, Rio de la Plata, and the general captaincies of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guatemala, Chile, and Venezuela send their representatives. Now, let us move to the relevance of the Constitution. Unlike other European constitutions after the fall of Napoleon in 1814, the Spanish text, both in concept and in action, had a significant presence in Latin America, which wasn't limited to the two moments in which it was implemented. I refer to the periods between 1812 and 1814 and 1820-1823. The deputies to the courts of Cádiz from both sides of the Atlantic, reunited 200 years ago, not only set up the foundations of the modern state on both sides of the Atlantic, but also opened a prosperous tradition of political and legal thought that arrives to our time. As far as constitutions are concerned, it should be considered that apart from being documents that summarize the legality of a country, constitutions are the manifestation of different ways of thinking about the society and the state. In that sense, in the book From Cádiz to the 21st Century, 100 Years of Hispanic American Constitutionalism, edited by my colleague from the Center of Research and Teaching in Economics, Pablo Mijangos, Rafael Rojas, and me in 2010, aim at reflecting the visions of societies and states in the Hispanic world articulated around the acts provided by Cádiz Constitution. The book aimed to provide a path to decipher the constitutional nations that emerged from the Spanish monarchy and that adopted the republican form of government already since the third decade of the 19th century. A path that went through a series of doctrinal and political stations over 2 centuries and that nowadays continues experiencing intense modifications. It is well known that after the first attempts, the emerging Latin American states were engaged in a long period of civil wars, territorial divisions, and authoritarian rule, culminating in the constitutional reorganization thereof. In most of these new countries won the constitutional model of 19th century liberalism, and very few conservative charters were implemented. The so-called republics of order and progress from the end of the 19th century incorporated elements of positivist conception of constitutional law and Latin America. Our book discusses this positivist legal and political platform contested since the first decades of the 20th century, nationalistic movements, but also informed revolutions and populism. From Mexico to Brazil, from Venezuela to Argentina, passing through Central America, the Caribbean, and the Andean countries, several generations of Latin American revolutionaries defended Cádiz liberal legacy. And they did so through the introduction of redistributive mechanisms of social rights, such as land reforms, forms of control of natural resources, among other issues. This book shows that contrary to the general belief, Latin American populist governments and the revolution of the 20th century were not social and political processes outside the constitutional tradition. They didn't seek or manage to get rid of the foundations of representative government, civil and political rights protected by Cádiz constitutionalism. The weight of these references is still quite powerful, even in the constitutions of the new Latin American left-wing constitutions. The book discusses, for example, the Venezuelan from 1999, Ecuadorian and Bolivian from 2010 and 2009. The book also stresses the fact the presence of Cádiz tradition is also evident in the consolidation of the Supreme Court and as interpreters and warrantors of the principles sanctioned by various constitutions of the region. Whilst the performance of these courts hasn't been free of errors, its mere continuation and reinforcement are concrete signs of the will to implement the state of law. In consequence, after 200 years from its promulgation, Cádiz Constitution still provides a framework for a great number of philosophies, experiences, and institutions to facilitate the basis for new constitutional models to face the multiple challenges of the 21st century. The first section of the book focuses on the origins and intellectual roots of the first Spanish constitutionalism. The book opens with a contribution by José María Portillo, who identified the common elements of the constitutional culture developed in both hemispheres of Spanish monarchy since 1808. In the following chapter, Roberto Breña reviews contemporary historiography on the constitutional explosion and the first Spanish liberalism. The third chapter by Catherine Andrews returns to the Anglo-Saxon criticisms of Cádiz model, particularly by American federalists and the British supporters of the balanced constitution. As noted by Andrews, thinkers as diverse as José María Luis Mora, Francisco Sánchez Tagle, and Lucas Alamán mixed the assembly system of Cádiz with the model of the French Jacobin institutions. Although at the time Mora, Sánchez Tagle, and Alamán were labeled as conservative or reactionary, these authors actually favor an alternative model of division of powers that reconcile individual freedom with effective government. In my chapter, I address the model represented by the greatest exponent of the School of Neapolitan Political Economy, Gaetano Filangieri, in his major work, The Science of Legislation. In that work, I located Filangieri's thinking in a broader philosophical discussion about new conceptions and human nature and the legal dilemma of skepticism. While the first section of the book deals with the intellectual history of emerging Spanish America constitutionalism, the second is dedicated to the daily practice of justice and constitutional government in the 19th century, this time taking Mexico as our reference and case studies. The common premise to the four works that form this section is that constitutions come to life through its application to the concrete cases, either in litigations involving a specific interest of the citizens and the state, or in a specific political context that clearly reveal the limits and flexibility of the fundamental law and the instrument of government. In the third section of the book, we examine the transformations introduced by the revolutions and populist governments in the 20th century Latin America. Once again, by analyzing some emblematic cases, mainly the Mexican Revolution, its influence in the regional constitutionalism, the Argentinian Peronism, the Cuban Revolution, and its impact on the ideology of Latin American left-wing movement. Of course, we are aware that these constitutional experiments were not the only ones producing nationalist and popular movements in the 20th century, but they were some of the most representative. In the third section of the fourth section of the book, there is the last section, is formed by three essays who analyzes the impression that American judges have of their own role in the constitutional democracy based on a systematic study of several cases. To conclude this presentation, I would like to emphasize the fact that the bicentenary of the Constitution of Cádiz coincided with a time of remarkable ideological and political pluralization in Latin America, along with the very well-known and not easy process of transition to democracy. In the same manner, we saw that the public life of the region faced new global problems such as drug trafficking, terrorism, migration, corruption, and insecurity. In this new context, it is clear that the constitutional and legal order must meet these challenges without limiting the autonomy of the judiciary and the human rights warranty of the democratic system. In this sense, I strongly believe that despite our book was published almost 8 years ago, the contributions that compose it are still a committed invitation to think about the challenges of the 21st century from a bicentennial constitutional tradition whose vitality is beyond doubt. While today challenges are different and perhaps more complex than the past ones, when we edited this book, we believe that the study of our old problems and solutions tested may offer us some clues necessary to imagine a viable state of law and rights for the region. Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. Now I'm going to take some questions. One is the influence of the Constitution of the United States comparable to the influence of Cádiz Constitution in the various constitutions of Mexico? I think this is a difficult question. I think that what we learned by doing this book is that Cádiz provided a framework, a cultural framework that provided us with certain limits and certain principles, whereas the Constitution of America, the United States of America, was a constitution that, of course, was always like a model of reference for all the modern democracies. I think it's difficult to evaluate because one constitutes like part of our cultural capital, whereas the other reflects the image or the model that our democracy wanted to reach. I don't know if I explain this, but one is something that is ours, whereas the other is an outside model with that serves as a model of comparison and during.
It was successful the Constitution of the United States was successful in influencing, I must say.
Yes, of course, because it's a model, it's an outside model to which there is always comparing, and we always wanted to reach certain parameters. But let's say that what I want to say is that the relation is different. One is something that belongs to us, that is part of our cultural capital, whereas the other is an external model to which we are comparing our developments all the time. Mm-hmm. Is there something? Yes, please. Thank you. I hope you understand. What could be the main reflections one should make when comparing today's challenges? The main reflections
of the Constitution of the Cádiz. You were saying that although this is like so long ago, this is a good time for us to reflect on the challenges that we're having nowadays. So my question was more like, what would be the main reflections that we can make when comparing the situation in this new?
Thank you very much. I have the impression that the I was trying to make a simile between that moment and Cádiz, the moment of the independence of Mexico and the process of Cádiz, because it was a process of creating a new identity. And I think that we are certainly nowadays in a same process of reinventing our identity due to all these problems. And Cádiz Constitution provided us with these principles that allow us to include the majority of the population and the different social classes in an enormous territory that was Mexico at the moment of the independence. I think that nowadays is always important to keep in mind those principles that we have defended along along our history. These human rights, the equality before the law, and so on and so forth. The limits of power that should be present always in the models that we have in mind. So yes, I think that this could be it's an invitation to reflect about what was part of our cultural capital and which are the principles that I think that still nowadays we should keep for the development of the state of law in the region. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. So,
All right.
should I say how do we conclude
Well,
this?
thank you very much. Muchas gracias, doctora Luna Fabritius, por esta presentación.
Gracias a ustedes por la invitación.